Good morning. I hope that your Wednesday is off to a good start. Mine is so far. Right here in my outdoor office with a second cup of coffee, good ship mug. I had initially not thought that I'd be free this morning to go live, but as it turns out, I am. And I'm going to be continuing what I began last week, which is simply a look at this intersection of faith in American life, and faith in particularly faith in American history, because that's something that is sort of in my wheelhouse. Once upon a time, I got a master's degree in history, and then went back to school, got my MDiv, so I've got my feet in both worlds there. And last week I talked about the earliest founding, the settling of the colonies, the religious world, the settling of the colonies. Now we fast forward. Now we fast forward to the founding of the country, not the founding of the colonies, and those are very different worlds. We fast forward 160 years, give or take a little bit. To give you some context, there is as much time or more that passed between the settlement, the early settlements, and the era of the founding, as there is between the Civil War and now. So if you think about it, the Civil War seems like it was like so long ago. 170 years, 160 years. And what do we have from the early settlements? 1609 for Jamestown to 1779, the middle of the Revolution, 170 years. 1789 for the Constitutional Convention, 180 years, and that's a long time that has passed. So we're going to look at the religious world at the time of the settlement. So the fledgling country, like in that time span in and around the Revolution through the Constitutional Convention, what is the religious landscape like? It's really different. A couple of things in particular. One is that in the early and middle part of the 1700s, there had been in the colonies and also in England a movement called the First Great Awakening. It was the Great Awakening. There have been one or two since then. There was the First Great Awakening, and with that you have a real outpouring of the Holy Spirit, and a lot of people come into faith. Churches being split over it. If you can imagine a 20-year time span where you have evangelists, revivalists going up and down the eastern seaboard in the colonies, attracting huge followings. The most famous of these was George Whitefield, but Jonathan Edwards had a role in the beginning of the First Great Awakening. The Wesley brothers were part of this over in England. So we had this explosion of religious fervor in the mid-1700s. The established churches of New England split in old lights and new lights. The old lights, the old guard, the more traditional, the new lights of those that embraced the awakening. You also have in the 1700s a real growth of what we might call dissenting churches, religious movements that didn't fit so neatly in the Anglican world. Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterians, just to name three. So you've got these dissenting religious movements, I've just named three of them, that are beginning to grow, particularly in the middle colonies in the South. You have the fracturing of the established church order in New England between old lights and new lights. So the religious landscape in the mid-late 1700s is much more complicated than it was in the 1620s. Now here's the next thing to put into the mix. The 1700s was the era of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment. And the upper classes of society, those who were better educated, were deeply steeped in Enlightenment thinking. This is the era of rationalism. And so the whole thought world is about what can we prove rationally? What can we prove rationally? This is an era which greatly valued and prized individual rights, individual liberties. And part of that is protecting people from state-run religions. They were greatly suspicious of state-run religions because that was an impingement upon individual liberties. This played out in terms of religion in that a lot of the more educated types, upper classes of society, their religion was, in a sense, they might have been a little bit religious, but they weren't at all spiritual. The term for that is deists. They believed that there was a God, but this God sort of created everything and then checked out. And this God was not directly involved in human affairs. So amongst our founders that all of you would have heard of, obviously George Washington. Washington is an interesting guy, according to people who've studied it, and there have been some who have studied this very deeply. Washington went to church on average about once a month. And when he was at home, when he's out in the field, like during the Revolution, that's not an option. But when he was at home and he could, he went to church about once a month. There were 2 different Anglican parishes that he attended. In fact, he helped start one of them. He did value prayer. He encouraged his armies to pray. He encouraged days of fasting and prayer for his armies. He encouraged and supported having chaplains for his troops. And so, on balance, I think that we can safely say that Washington really was a believer. Washington was a Christian. What about for some of the others? You think about the committee that was responsible for the Declaration of Independence. 3 of them we've all heard of: Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams. And there's Roger Sherman, John Witherspoon. Now the other 2, very few people have ever heard of. Of this committee of 5, really only one can we say for certain was really a Christian. Jefferson was thorough deist. He is in the altar, on the altar, but in the rotunda of the Jefferson Memorial, there's this quote that's inscribed up there, and it's a quote of his: "I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man." It's a great quote, and he gave that quote in its context in a letter where he's opposing state-imposed religions. He doesn't like anything that impinges upon the freedom of human thought. He valued Jesus as a moral teacher, but did not buy into any of the more miraculous aspects of the Christian faith. He's famous or notorious for having edited a version of the New Testament in which he just sort of carved out all the miracles. John Adams, self-described a Unitarian, so it's not really Christian either. Benjamin Franklin was a famous skeptic. The story is told that he went to hear George Whitefield preach one time. Whitefield, the greatest preacher of his era, one of the best of any era, and Franklin at the end said, "You almost convinced me." So we need to have in our mind the idea that the founding fathers, weren't all people that carried their Bibles to church with them. Some were certainly good Christians. I think Washington probably was, and others were not. But here's the thing. In the era of the founding, they recognized that religion was a positive good in society. They believed that religion could be a positive good. And in that respect, they're different from current society. In our current society, there is certainly an element which views religion as being bad. That religion, especially Christianity, is bad in that it promotes judgmentalism and hatefulness. Obviously, I don't think that's true as a Christian myself, but there is that thought out there. In that world, the founders, even if they weren't deeply committed Christians, they recognized that religion was good. That if a people were religious, if they went to church, that they were more likely to be good citizens, they were more likely to obey the laws. And so that is sort of the religious world of that era. Amongst the founders, there were a lot that were deists, not really Christians as we would call them. Some of them were Christians, others certainly were not. And certainly they were not trying to create a Bible-based society. No. They're trying to create a good society based upon natural laws, which they did believe were given by God. But a lot of them weren't really committed Christians, as we would call them. But they recognized that religion was a positive good. So let's think about the rationalism of that era. It's, what can we prove? What can we prove? What can be empirically proven? That's what matters. And obviously that sort of runs against the grain for Christianity or for other faiths, because our faith involves something that cannot be proven, but something that cannot be empirically measured. They were big on natural law. They were big on political philosophy. And these two were tied into the rationalist Enlightenment world. They were deeply suspicious of state-run religions. They sort of had some religion with, they sort of had some background with that. The Church of England, officially headed by the king, they sort of had some background with that, and they didn't like it. So for them, they deeply valued freedom of religion, and would have, and for them, the government shouldn't be explicitly religious, but the government should not be impinging on the freedom to exercise religion. The government should be, I guess, sort of agnostic. It's not the government. The government cannot be in the business of stamping down or preventing religious expression, because that runs against their whole business of individual liberties and natural laws, which they believed were given by God, however they define God. But on the other hand, they were also, as part of the Enlightenment, they were also deeply committed to free exercise of religion, in that you should not be compelled by a government to worship in this way, or in this place, or in that way, or in that place. Washington apparently was very deeply committed to the idea of religious liberty, extending beyond the various facets of Christendom to extend to Judaism, and Jefferson as well. And in Jefferson's own writing, he extended that to include Muslims, Hindus. And Jefferson wrote, principal author of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. And that's one of three things that he was most proud of at the end of his life. The other two being drafting the Declaration of Independence and founding the University of Virginia. And he was really proud of this Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, which made it into the Virginia Constitution when the Commonwealth of Virginia was founded. We believe that people have the right to worship however they see fit, and the government can't impinge on that. That's the world of the framers. That's the world of the framers. This idea of enlightenment, rationalism, natural law, and the government cannot be in the business of preventing people from worshiping however they see fit, and cannot be in the business of impinging on how people worship, or directing people towards one faith or another. That's sort of the thought world of the era in which the country is founded. It's again, I think probably a little different than how we commonly envision it, but that's the world as it was. And anyway, with that, I hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday.